200 earthquakes in 5 days beneath a stretch of California desert that sits on top of confirmed molten rock, and the federal government issued not one public warning. The alert level never moved. Not once. Before dismissing this as another doomsday video, it's worth sitting with the actual shape of what happened, because the real story here isn't a hidden eruption. It's something almost stranger, a volcanic field with confirmed magma underneath it, sitting inside one of the most restricted military zones in the American West, watched by exactly 1 public seismometer, 0 gas sensors, 0 tilt meters, and 3 GPS receivers spread across 400 square kilometers of active volcanic terrain. When that field produced its most unusual earthquake sequence in years, the monitoring network wasn't dense enough to answer the question with confidence either way. That gap, not the earthquakes themselves, is what deserves scrutiny. Start with the geography, because most coverage of this event got the basic picture wrong. The Coso volcanic field sits in Inyo County, roughly 100 miles northeast of Bakersfield, and about 40 miles north of Ridgecrest. It isn't a mountain. There's no cone, no snow-capped peak, nothing that would show up on a postcard. Coso is a sprawling volcanic complex, dozens of rhyolite lava domes, cinder cones, lava flows, hot springs, and fumaroles spread across roughly 400 square kilometers, where the eastern flank of the Sierra Nevada drops into the northern Mojave Desert. Most of that terrain sits inside the boundary of Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake, which means most of it is closed to civilian access entirely. The last confirmed eruption at Coso happened roughly 40,000 years ago, a basaltic cinder cone and its accompanying lava flow, 40,000 years of quiet on the surface. Beneath that quiet, geophysical studies have confirmed something worth taking seriously. There is a zone of partially molten rock underneath Coso. Not inferred, not suspected. Confirmed. The California Volcano Observatory, the USGS office responsible for monitoring the state's volcanic systems, lists Coso as one of only 7 volcanic features in all of California with actual magma beneath it. 7 out of every volcanic feature the state has. So when a field with confirmed melt underneath it, quiet on the surface for 40 millennia, produces more than 200 earthquakes in 5 days, including one that rounds to magnitude 4, that's not nothing. It's a sequence that deserves real scrutiny. The question is whether it deserved a public warning, and answering that requires understanding exactly what the sequence looked like, because the shape of it turns out to matter more than the raw count. Between August 20th and August 25th of this year, the USGS catalog recorded more than 200 earthquakes beneath the Coso volcanic field. That's the public network figure, and there's good reason to think the real number was substantially higher, which we'll return to. Using what's public, the sequence unfolded like this. Thursday the 20th produced 16 cataloged events. Friday jumped to 52, a sharp spike that would catch the attention of any monitoring seismologist, and by that Friday afternoon, the strongest recorded event had reached magnitude 3.4. Then Saturday collapsed. 9 events, an 80% drop back toward ordinary background levels. Anyone watching the catalog Saturday evening would reasonably have concluded the episode was winding down. Swarms often behave that way, flaring and fading within a day or two. Then Sunday arrived, and the sequence more than doubled its earlier peak, producing well over 100 events in a single day. Every one of the sequence's largest earthquakes arrived inside that second surge, several of them clustering inside a window of roughly an hour and a quarter in the middle of Sunday night, right around midnight Pacific time. The largest earthquake of the entire sequence struck in that window, computed from data across dozens of seismic stations with tight azimuthal coverage and a small location error, landing right at magnitude 4.0, at a depth of just under 3 kilometers. Within minutes, additional magnitude 3 plus events followed at nearly identical depths. 3 earthquakes above magnitude 3 within roughly 78 minutes, at a volcanic field with confirmed magma beneath it, and no public statement followed. Here's why the shape of that sequence matters as much as the raw numbers. In seismology, there are 2 fundamentally different kinds of earthquake sequences, and they point to different physical processes underground. The first is what follows a standard main shock, a single fault rupture. After that event, the crust relaxes in a well-established, predictable way, aftershocks. Decay according to what's known as Omori's law, formulated more than a century ago, where the rate of aftershocks falls off as roughly the inverse of elapsed time since the main shock. Fast at first, then progressively slower, always trending down. It's one of the most reliable patterns in the entire field. Coso's swarm did not do that. The magnitudes climbed over the 5 days rather than decaying, rising through the sequence with the largest event arriving roughly 72 hours after activity began. The sequence appeared to end on Saturday, then restarted at more than double the earlier intensity on Sunday. That's the textbook signature of a swarm rather than a main shock aftershock sequence, and it implies something specific about the underlying physics. A decaying aftershock sequence is a single release of stress relaxing outward. A swarm that stops, restarts, and escalates is a driven process, something applying stress repeatedly in pulses, rather than something that broke once and is now settling. That distinction matters because a driven process implies an active, ongoing cause. The question was what that cause actually was. Now the geometry, which is the part almost no coverage of this event actually reported. Every significant earthquake in the sequence fell inside an area roughly a kilometer north to south and about 600 meters east to west, an area you could walk across in about 10 minutes. The depths were just as tightly confined, with the overwhelming majority of events sitting between 2.5 and just under 3 kilometers below the surface, a depth range barely over a kilometer thick across the entire sequence. That specific number, roughly 2.5 to 3 kilometers, turns out to be the single most important fact in the whole story. Here's why it matters so much. Multiple independent scientific studies, conducted across more than 4 decades using different techniques, have tried to locate exactly where the magma sits, beneath Coso, and every single one puts it significantly deeper than 3 kilometers. Early geophysical work from around 1980 identified a low-velocity body, the standard geophysical signature of melt, somewhere between 10 and 17 kilometers down. Later research refined that picture with a shallower reservoir estimate around 5 kilometers, and a deeper discontinuity near 15. Subsequent studies described a broad, sill-shaped magma body, tens of kilometers long and several kilometers thick, sitting between roughly 11 and 16 kilometers depth. A comprehensive seismic tomography study published in the early 2020s, built from well over 100,000 travel time measurements, imaged a low-velocity body spanning roughly 5 to 20 kilometers depth. Every estimate across 4 decades of research, using different instruments and different methods, places the shallowest credible top of the magma reservoir at 5 kilometers or deeper. The earthquakes from this swarm were happening at 2.5 to 3 kilometers. That leaves a minimum of roughly 2 kilometers of solid rock separating the shaking from the melt, and that intervening rock isn't ordinary in a way that matters enormously here. Beneath the Coso geothermal field, the brittle to ductile transition, the depth at which rock stops cracking and producing earthquakes and instead begins to flow plastically under heat and pressure has been pushed dramatically upward by the geothermal heat below it. In most of the surrounding region, that transition sits around 11 kilometers down. At Coso, it's been compressed upward to somewhere around 4 to 5 kilometers. The heat has squeezed the entire zone capable of producing brittle, catalogable earthquakes into a comparatively thin shell near the surface. That compression has 2 consequences pointing in the same direction. First, the earthquakes physically cannot occur much shallower than the brittle ductile boundary allows, because above, a certain temperature threshold rock stops fracturing and starts flowing, and flowing rock doesn't generate the kind of sharp seismic signal that shows up in an earthquake catalog. Second, and this is the more important point, pressure changes within that shallow, brittle fracture network don't propagate meaningfully across the brittle ductile boundary into the melt zone underneath it. The seismicity and the magma are, in a real physical sense, mechanically walled off from each other. The 2 zones aren't communicating in the way that would signal a genuine volcanic crisis building toward the surface. There's one more line of evidence that strengthens the non-volcanic explanation, and it involves one of the clearest warning signs volcanologists look for when evaluating whether a swarm relates to magma movement. When magma, or magmatic fluid, pushes upward through the crust, it fractures rock ahead of itself, and those fractures generate earthquakes. As magma continues rising, the earthquakes rise with it, migrating shallower week over week, a front advancing toward the surface. That upward migration is considered the single clearest seismic fingerprint of magma actively on the move, and it is completely absent from the Coso catalog during this swarm. Nothing in the data shows systematic shallowing over time. The events sit static, confined to the same roughly 1 kilometer deep band for all 5 days, varying in intensity but not in depth. That's not what rising magma looks like. So, if magma isn't driving this, what is applying repeated stress to that specific patch of crust? The most coherent answer sits directly on top of the earthquakes, and it's been running continuously since 1987. The Coso geothermal field is one of the larger geothermal power operations in the United States, with multiple power blocks, feeding a rated generating capacity in the hundreds of megawatts. The gathering system connects well over 100 wells across nearly 15,000 acres, with dozens of production wells and dozens of injection wells, operating across the field, drawing from reservoir temperatures well above 200 degrees Celsius and moving an enormous mass flow of fluid every single hour. This is a genuinely industrial-scale operation, continuously extracting thermal energy from the rock beneath Coso. The well depths matter here. Production wells at Coso run from several hundred meters down to more than 4 kilometers, and the entire earthquake swarm, top to bottom, sits inside that exact depth interval. The seismicity, the brine, the steam, and the cooler, re-injected water are all occupying the same slab of rock. This isn't speculation. It's established in peer-reviewed literature specific to this field. Research examining why Coso produced almost no aftershocks following the 2019 magnitude 7.1 Ridgecrest earthquake, despite seismic models predicting it should have, found that 3 decades of geothermal heat extraction had already depleted much of the stored shear stress within the reservoir, essentially using up the mechanical energy that would otherwise have produced aftershocks. In establishing that finding, the same body of research stated plainly that thermal contraction of the reservoir had itself been inducing substantial seismicity at Coso for years. Pull heat out of rock continuously and the rock contracts, contracting rock cracks. That's a published, non-controversial mechanism operating at exactly this location. More recent research has gone further, analyzing well over a decade of local seismic data alongside daily operational records from the geothermal field itself. That analysis found a strong correlation between short-term increases in the local earthquake rate and seasonal changes in both the volume and the temperature of fluid being pumped back into the ground. During periods of peak injection of colder fluid, the seismic response was close to instantaneous and measurable up to 2 kilometers from the injection point, far too fast to be explained by pressure slowly diffusing through the rock matrix over time. The mechanism appears to be thermal and hydromechanical, propagating through the reservoir's fracture network almost immediately after injection changes. Read that against the shape of this particular swarm. A driven process applying stress in pulses, activity that switches on Thursday, fades Saturday, then switches back on harder Sunday, confined to a single kilometer of crust at one specific depth band that happens to match exactly where the wells operate. Nobody outside the geothermal operator has access to last week's actual injection schedule. That data isn't public, so this explanation can't be stated as definitively proven. But among the available explanations, it's the one that accounts for the 2-pulse structure, the extreme spatial confinement, the depth, and the timing all at once. The geothermal operation is, on the evidence available, the most coherent account of what the catalog actually shows. One more data point sharpens the picture further. Output from the Coso geothermal field has roughly halved over its operating lifetime, declining from its rated capacity and an early peak down to something closer to half that figure today. That decline is the signature of a rock body that has been substantially cooled by nearly 4 decades of continuous extraction. The thermal reservoir is depleting, and as it depletes, the ground above it has been sinking. Satellite radar. Measurements going back to the 1990s recorded subsidence across a significant area of the field at rates up to several centimeters per year in the most affected zones. More recent measurements show that subsidence continuing at a slower but still measurable rate. For as long as anyone has tracked it instrumentally, the ground at Coso has been going down. Volcanoes building toward eruption generally go up as magma accumulates and inflates the ground above it. Coso has been doing the opposite. Now to the part that deserves genuine attention rather than dismissal. Even accepting every piece of the scientific reasoning above, even if the decision to leave the alert level unchanged was correct, even if the geothermal explanation holds up, there's a question none of that fully answers. How confident can anyone actually be in that conclusion, given the instruments actually in the ground? The USGS operates exactly one public seismometer near the Coso. Volcanic field, installed in 2001. The deformation network consists of 3 continuous GPS receivers. There's no gas monitoring at Coso at all, no tilt meters, no strain meters. For comparison, Long Valley Caldera, another California volcanic system roughly 200 kilometers to the north, is monitored by dozens of GPS receivers and multiple tilt meters. The difference isn't subtle. It's the gap between a genuinely dense monitoring network and a skeleton crew of instruments covering 400 square kilometers of confirmed active volcanic terrain. The USGS's own public catalog for the week in question recorded dozens of earthquakes above magnitude 1 at Coso, with the largest at magnitude 4.0, as part of a tightly clustered sequence. But that public figure is very likely a significant undercount of what actually happened underground. Separate monitoring, conducted by the Navy using its own downhole and surface seismometers at the geothermal field, can resolve events down to negative magnitudes, meaning it can detect earthquakes many times smaller than anything the public USGS catalog captures. The real number of seismic events during that week was almost certainly far higher than the public catalog shows. That finer-grained data exists. It simply isn't public. Look at the California Volcano Observatory's own published framework for evaluating whether a swarm represents genuine volcanic risk, because it's a useful lens here. Their process runs through several steps: which stations detect the signal, what the depth, location, and character of the events look like, sharp and distinct suggesting brittle rock fracture versus broad and low frequency suggesting fluid or magma movement. And then, critically, what the other data streams show. In the observatory's own framing, magma pushing into the shallow crust has to physically displace surrounding rock, producing measurable ground deformation, and the gases that accompany rising magma have to escape somewhere, producing detectable changes at surface vents and fumaroles. If neither signal shows up, the source is either not magmatic or isn't going anywhere significant. At Coso, deformation monitoring rests on 3 GPS receivers spread across 400 square kilometers. Gas isn't monitored at all. The observatory's own decisive third step, the one that actually distinguishes magma from everything else, depends on instrumentation that's either present in bare minimum numbers or entirely absent. The California Volcano Observatory's most recent weekly update, issued at the end of August, confirmed all California volcanoes remain at normal background levels of seismicity and deformation, with the aviation color code at green across the board. That conclusion is very likely correct, based on everything laid out above. But the reason it deserves to be stated explicitly rather than simply accepted at face value is that the instrument network at Coso is thin enough that certain early warning signals could plausibly be missed or caught late in their earliest stages. There's a partial defense of that thin coverage worth taking seriously. The threat ranking that determines how heavily a volcano gets monitored isn't arbitrary. The USGS uses a multi-criterion assessment combining hazard factors with population exposure to rank volcanoes. By monitoring priority, and Coso lands in the moderate band, well outside the top tier, in large part because the population within 10 kilometers of the field numbers only in the low hundreds, and much of the terrain sits inside a restricted military installation rather than open, populated land. Coso is monitored roughly in proportion to what it could realistically do to people if conditions changed. That's a defensible allocation of finite monitoring resources. But here's the tension with that defense in this specific case. The USGS's own published hazard assessment for Coso describes what an eruption there would likely look like and what would precede it in fairly specific language. Earthquakes would precede any eruption, and weeks to months of heightened seismicity combined with measurable ground deformation would probably come before any future event. Because the region is already geothermally active, an eruption would likely begin with a series of low-level steam blasts before any actual magmatic material reached the surface. That's worth reading carefully because it draws an important distinction. Earthquakes preceding an eruption is a necessary condition for the warning system to function, as designed, but it isn't a sufficient one by itself. The stated precursor package is weeks to months of elevated seismicity combined with a deformation signal. 5 days of shallow, spatially confined shaking with no accompanying deformation isn't that package. It isn't close to it. Putting the swarm in its proper historical context helps too, because it isn't even the largest thing Coso has produced in recent years. After the magnitude 7.1 Ridgecrest earthquake struck less than 40 miles away in July 2019, the Coso field was producing on the order of several 100 magnitude 1 or greater earthquakes per day in the immediate aftermath, with a dozen or more reaching magnitude 3 and the largest events touching magnitude 4.1. This most recent swarm ran at a small fraction of that daily rate, and its largest event was slightly smaller than those 2019 peaks. 7 years later, Coso produced a meaningfully smaller version of what it did after Ridgecrest, and nothing in the intervening years suggests a gradual buildup towards something larger. That 2019 comparison also illustrates something useful about how a genuinely externally triggered swarm behaves differently from one generated by internal processes like fluid injection. Ridgecrest was a massive, well-understood tectonic earthquake tens of kilometers away, and the shaking it produced directly triggered a burst of activity at Coso through dynamic stress transfer, a well-documented phenomenon where seismic waves passing through an already stressed geothermal system can trigger a rapid, short-lived spike in local seismicity before decaying back to baseline over subsequent weeks. That triggered swarm faded in a fairly conventional way, once the dynamic stress from the passing seismic waves dissipated. This most recent sequence had no comparable trigger. There was no large regional earthquake in the days beforehand capable of explaining a sudden onset. Whatever drove the two-pulse pattern this time originated locally, within the field itself, which is part of why the operational injection-driven explanation fits the available evidence better than either a magmatic origin or a distant tectonic trigger. So where does that leave the overall picture? The swarm was real, and it was genuinely unusual in its structure. The two-pulse pattern, the escalating magnitudes within the sequence, the extreme spatial confinement, all of that is worth taking seriously as an interesting seismological event. But the evidence pointing away from a magmatic cause is strong and comes from several independent directions at once. The earthquakes sat roughly 2 kilometers above the shallowest credible position of the magma reservoir. They occurred on the wrong side of the brittle ductile boundary that mechanically prevents shallow pressure changes from reaching the melt zone below. They lined up almost exactly with the depth interval where the geothermal field's own wells operate. There was no upward migration, no ground deformation signal, and no change at the fumaroles or hot springs. The alert level stayed at normal because the available evidence genuinely supports normal. For decades, that single signal matters more than any earthquake count on its own because swelling ground means something underground is expanding and at a confirmed magmatic system. Expansion means fluid, or magma, is on the move. The network is thin, but it's there and recording continuously. The second is a change in the character of the earthquakes themselves. Right now, the signals are sharp and distinct, the seismic signature of brittle rock breaking. If that shifts toward broad, low-frequency prolonged signals, the kind associated with fluid or magma moving through fractures rather than rock cracking, or if sustained harmonic tremor appears, that would represent a fundamental change in subsurface behavior. Signals of exactly that type preceded the 1980 eruption at Mount St. Helens by months. The third is upward migration, a detectable trend of future earthquakes appearing systematically shallower over time rather than sitting static in the same depth band, which remains the clearest seismic fingerprint of magma actually advancing toward the surface. The fourth is any measurable change at the surface, new. Openings at the fumaroles or hot springs, rising temperatures, or shifts in gas emission from the current baseline, all of which would be direct evidence of change in the hydrothermal system, sitting above the magma reservoir. There's a fifth signal that's procedural rather than geological, and it's worth knowing simply because it tells you when to actually start paying closer attention. If the California Volcano Observatory issues an information statement specifically naming Coso, that's the system signaling that scientists have shifted from routine watching to active concern. Under the observatory's published protocol, an information statement precedes any change in alert level. As of the most recent update, no such statement had been issued for Coso. When one is, it will be public, and it will be the earliest official indicator that the picture has genuinely changed. Right now, none of those five things are happening, and the underlying science behind the silence is solid. But there's a reason to say all of this explicitly, rather than simply accepting the quiet and moving on. At Coso, the margin for error in monitoring is thinner than at almost any other volcano on California's list. 3 GPS receivers and no gas monitoring is not a network built to catch subtlety early. It happened to be adequate this time, because this particular swarm displayed its non-magmatic character clearly through the earthquake catalog alone. The depth was wrong for magma, the pattern was wrong for magma, and deformation was absent. It was legible from seismology alone without needing gas data, or a denser GPS array to make the call. The next swarm at Coso might not be nearly so legible. There could come a sequence where the depth sits in a genuinely ambiguous zone, where 3 GPS stations can't clearly distinguish real inflation from instrument noise, where the total absence of gas monitoring stops being a secondary concern and becomes the central uncertainty in the entire assessment. When that day comes, the thinness of the public monitoring network at a volcanic field with confirmed magma underneath it, sitting largely inside a restricted military installation in the California desert, will matter enormously. It's worth taking a moment to explain why building out that monitoring network isn't simply a matter of writing a check and installing more equipment, because the obstacles here are genuinely unusual compared to most other volcanic systems in the country. The bulk of the Coso volcanic field sits inside an active naval weapons testing range, one of the largest of its kind in the country, used for live fire testing, weapons development, and airspace restricted for military operations. Placing new civilian scientific infrastructure inside that boundary requires coordination between the USGS and the Navy that goes well beyond the logistics involved in installing a GPS receiver on open public land elsewhere in the Sierra Nevada or the Cascades. Access has to be scheduled around testing activity. Equipment has to be sited in locations that don't interfere with military operations, and maintenance visits require the same coordination every time a station needs servicing. None of that makes denser monitoring impossible. Agencies do coordinate successfully in far more sensitive contexts than this, but it does help. Explain why a volcanic field with confirmed magma underneath it has ended up with meaningfully sparser coverage than comparable systems on open land, even though the underlying geological hazard doesn't particularly care whose jurisdiction the ground sits under. It's also worth being clear-eyed about what a genuinely bad case scenario at Coso would actually look like, not to manufacture fear, but because understanding the realistic shape of the hazard is part of understanding why the monitoring gap matters. The USGS's own hazard. Assessment doesn't describe Coso as a candidate for a large explosive eruption on the scale of a stratovolcano. The volcanic history here is dominated by relatively modest rhyolite dome-building eruptions and basaltic cinder cone activity, the kind of eruptive style that tends to be preceded by exactly the drawn-out precursor sequence described earlier, weeks to months of escalating unrest, rather than a sudden, poorly telegraphed blast. The realistic danger profile is less about a catastrophic surprise and more about the possibility that a genuine early-stage unrest sequence gets misread, either dismissed too quickly because the instrumentation is too sparse to distinguish it from background noise, or, just as plausible, overinterpreted because a thin network produces ambiguous data that gets filled in with speculation rather than measurement. Either failure mode traces back to the same root problem: not enough instruments in the ground to make a confident call when it actually counts. There's a broader pattern here worth naming, because Coso isn't the only moderately ranked volcanic system in the country facing this exact tension between hazard and monitoring investment. Volcano monitoring funding in the United States has historically tracked closely with a small handful of systems judged to pose the highest combined threat to large population centers, places like the Cascade volcanoes near Seattle and Portland, or Long Valley given its proximity to a resort community and its history of unrest. That prioritization makes sense as a starting point when resources are finite, but it produces exactly the kind of gap seen at Coso. A system with confirmed magma, a documented if modest eruptive history, and genuinely unusual seismic behavior, sitting well down the funding priority list because the population exposure calculation comes out low. The result isn't that Coso goes completely unwatched. 1 seismometer and 3 GPS stations is still meaningfully more than 0, but it does mean that when something genuinely ambiguous happens there, as it very well might someday, the tools available to resolve that ambiguity quickly will be thinner than anyone monitoring a higher priority system would consider adequate. None of this is a criticism of the scientists doing the actual monitoring work with the instruments they have, the California Volcano Observatory's weekly public updates, the willingness to publish a detailed hazard framework explaining exactly what precursor signals they're watching. 4, and the transparency around what the current network can and can't resolve are all genuinely good practice, arguably better public communication than exists for many higher profile hazards elsewhere in the country. The gap being described here isn't a failure of judgment by the people doing the work. It's a resourcing decision made somewhere upstream of them, one that happens to leave a volcanic field with confirmed melt beneath it running on instrumentation that was largely put in place decades ago and hasn't meaningfully expanded since. That resourcing question is ultimately the one worth carrying away from this whole sequence, more than any single earthquake count or magnitude figure. A system that gets the science right this time, using nothing but a sparse seismic catalog to correctly identify an operational than magmatic cause, is a genuine success story about the underlying quality of the analysis. But quality of analysis and adequacy of instrumentation are two different things, and this event happened to be one where the first could compensate for the thinness of the second. Not every future sequence will be quite so forgiving of that gap, and knowing that in advance, rather than discovering it during a genuinely ambiguous crisis, is the entire point of laying all of this out now, while the situation remains, by every available measure, calm. The earthquakes over that 5-day stretch were almost certainly not a volcanic warning, but they were, in a real sense, a warning about something else entirely. How narrow the margin actually is between knowing and not knowing at a genuinely active volcanic system watched by one federal seismometer that has been sitting in the ground since 2001. The available evidence lines up cleanly enough this time that the government's silence was very likely the right call. Whether that stays true the next time the ground beneath Coso starts moving depends on instruments that, right now, mostly aren't there,